Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood. In March, which is Iowa History Month, the Iowa History 101 webinar series expands to every Tuesday and Thursday. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will discuss the changing physical environment of Iowa in the 1850s and how the worst winter on record in northwestern Iowa led to escalating tensions between settler populations and indigenous peoples in 1856 to 1857, and what Inkpaduta's attack on Spirit Lake means today. We acknowledge the indigenous peoples that have called Iowa home since time immemorial, as well as the more than 17,000 Native people who live in Iowa today. We acknowledge the land, now known as the state of Iowa, was the ancestral home for the Iowa Nation, and our state is named in recognition of them. Iowa was also an ancestral home at times for the Oto-Missouri, Meskwaki, Sauk, Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Omaha-Ponca, and the Potawatomi, as well as other tribes that passed through at various times. The language used to identify many of our lakes, rivers, cities, counties, schools, buildings, and sites reflect the inherent imprint of indigenous peoples. We offer our respect to their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples who have made an essential contribution to the landscape of Iowa, including traditional knowledge, experience, labor, technology, science, philosophy, and the arts. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are now available by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kevin Mason. Kevin is an assistant professor of history at Waldorf University. He is a rural and environmental historian by specialization, focused on the American Midwest during the 19th and 20th centuries. He has researched rural flight and development of industry in rural spaces. Kevin has his doctorate in rural and environmental history from Iowa State University, and he will be presenting some of his doctoral research with us today. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Kevin to begin the webinar.
Thanks, Jennifer. I appreciate all of you stopping in here virtually to visit with me today as we celebrate Iowa History Month. I want to draw your attention to part of our shared past that's served as the focus of my research over the past 5 years since I started my doctoral work at Iowa State. The content within this presentation is a distillation of that doctoral work, and many of the things I will talk about today are included in a forthcoming article for Annals of Iowa that's going to come out later this spring. So I'd appreciate if you keep an eye out for that, and there will be some more information. I'm going to read some parts of that today, but I hope you'll check it out when it comes out. Growing up in Iowa, I was aware of the 1857 attack by Inkpaduta on Spirit Lake that occurred 164 years ago this weekend. Inkpaduta and his band of Wapakute, Dakota violently attacked the collected American settlements surrounding Spirit Lake. Over the course of several days, the band moved from cabin to cabin, leaving a tale of destruction resulting in at least 39 casualties. Iowans remember this as the Spirit Lake Massacre, and public memory cast the event as the senseless and brutal murder of innocent Americans at the hands of a bloodthirsty and indigenous people. But for decades, Inkpaduta and his band of Wapakute, Dakota watched the familiar environment they expertly used to survive disintegrate around them. The Wapakute Dakota attack on Spirit Lake in March of 1857 resulted only after their carefully developed lifeways collapsed and other types of resistance failed in the face of extreme circumstances during American settlement. In the aftermath, Inkpaduta and his band fled west, beyond the reach of American justice, and continued to live life with their Lakota and Yanktonese relatives. Although often characterized by a brief moment of incredible violence, parts of the Dakota ranged and lived in Iowa for at least hundreds of years. Historical interpretations of the event have helped to undercut understanding of the Dakota's place as an important indigenous people to this state prior to American settlement. We tell these stories in a lot of different ways. We have a lot of different sources we could look at. The most dominant in this narrative has been that of Abby Gardner Sharp, who lived through unfathomable violence as her family was killed and she was taken captive in the attack. Other people have sought to interpret this. People like Thomas Teakle, who while he was working at Des Moines North High School during the early 20th century, wrote the first major scholarly book about this. And we've seen modern entries into this as well by historians like Paul Beck, who wrote a wonderful book about Inkpaduta called Inkpaduta Dakota Leader that came out a few years ago, as well as other books that kind of touch on this as well, like Gwen Westerman and Bruce White's work that also came out recently, specifically about the Dakota people. But as we look at Inkpaduta, in the first 15 years of the 19th century, nestled among the big blue stem of an endless prairie stretching across what soon became Iowa and Minnesota, a mother gave birth to a son. When he first opened his eyes, he could not have comprehended how he might come to represent the incredible changes soon to come to his people, the Wapakute Dakota, or how his memory might overshadow the legacy of the Dakota in Iowa for well over a century. His father, a war chief of the Wapakute named Wam Desapa, welcomed his firstborn son. His name, Inkpaduta, eventually struck fear into the hearts of American settlers throughout the developing frontier of the upper Midwest. But more importantly, his life and legacy embodied the plight of dispossession and erasure suffered by the Wapakute Dakota in Iowa. Over the course of the first half of the 19th century, Inkpaduta came of age on the prairies of what later became Iowa and Minnesota as a part of a wide-ranging people commonly referred to as the Sioux. Prior to his attack on Spirit Lake, Inkpaduta led a small group of Wapakute Dakota across a range stretching from at least the Shell Rock River in north-central Iowa to the confluence of the Missouri and Little Sioux rivers in extreme western Iowa. We know this because of interactions, positive and negative, between settlers and other peoples entering the area. For instance, on the Shell Rock River, there was an incident where Inkpaduta kidnapped two people coming up to explore. We also see him trading with a variety of people and popping up in some of those types of records, both people like Joseph Hewitt in Mason City, Clear Lake, as well as people further west in places like Smithland or the Sioux City area. We also know he had peaceable relations with people like Charles Lamb at the Smithland settlement, and also asserted autonomy and sovereignty over other people like Ambrose Call and surveying parties in the Algona area. We also have a variety of military records from people like William Williams, the post-settler at Fort Dodge, who records Inkpaduta regularly. So across the landscape, stretching across dozens of Iowa's eventual counties, Inkpaduta's people utilized knowledge passed down from generations before them to survive in what we all know to be a very difficult climate. The burgeoning American influence and settlement of the area exacerbated the challenges faced by Inkpaduta and the Wapakute during a period of extreme change over the first half of the 19th century, ultimately culminating in his attack on Spirit Lake. Only through recognizing and understanding how the Dakota lived in Iowa and how individuals, including Inkpaduta, sought to navigate a rapidly changing world, can we begin to better reconcile, honor, and understand the true and extensive legacy of the Dakota in Iowa's history. We can do this through a critical examination of sources that places an emphasis on Dakota voices and Dakota traditions, but also through critically reading other sources like those of missionaries like Samuel Pond or Stephen Return Riggs, looking at primary sources and reading against the grain, taking a look at settler records left behind, as well as things like detailed census information that I'll show you some of the things I worked on as we went through this. Also, current scholars work on this. The work of James J. Dinsmore and his quantification of Iowa wildlife is really important to this. And then also archaeologists have had a hand in how we understand this. People doing great work like William Whitaker. Most importantly, we want to make sure that we're keeping Dakota sources in the forefront of our mind. And as we think about the Dakota, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work Christopher Pexa did related to the Dakota in his book, Translated Nation, which came out last year. So at the time of first European contact, Dakota, a term reflecting a collective identity shared by an array of named bands of Siouan-speaking peoples, refer to themselves as the Oceti-Sakowin, or the Seven Council Fires. The Oceti-Sakowin consisted of 7 Oyate, or peoples, including the Wapakute. The Oceti-Sakowin bound the people to one another in the universe by the mysteriousness of being known as Wakin. The Dakota found linkage through kinship, alliance, and language. The Oyate of the Oceti-Sakowin consisted of groupings of Teoyaspe, or bands. Each Teoyaspe consisted of roughly 5 to 20 families, making up an individual camp circle. Although more often associated with the more westerly portions of the tribe, the Dakota frequently utilized the term to describe their more clan-like band structure even into the 21st century. For example, the Wapakute Oyate consisted of Tayoyaspes under specific leaders like Inkpaduta or Sinto-Miniduta. The Tayoyaspe existed as kin, regardless of biological reality, and those relationships underpinned and set the patterns of Dakota existence on a day-to-day basis. We want to make sure to keep in mind that the Dakota are not a fixed relic of the past frozen in a specific moment of time. Sometimes modern audiences will tend to picture the Dakota as part of a bygone era, often as an esoteric remnant of the frontier situated on horseback, hunting bison. In reality, the Dakota adaptively faced challenges to persist into the modern day. The regimented yet variable nature of Dakota kinship organization allowed for flexibility and fluidity when encountering new challenges, and the Dakota continue to have a vibrant culture and existence today. As we look at some of these kind of examples, we can see smaller units combined when necessary for tasks including diplomacy, warfare, or large hunts, when smaller units were even more advantageous, specifically during lean winter months like those faced by Inkpaduta in the winter of 1856-57. The Dakota maintained social construction while geographically dispersing to burden available resources less. The adaptability of Dakota leaders like Inkpaduta provided the opportunity to consistently adjust to the circumstances presented by the natural environment. As we see this, we know that living in Iowa, it takes a lot, especially if you're going to live off the land. And we want to make sure that we're looking at the Dakota as a people that were seeking to do that and living here successfully for hundreds of years. Early European accounts struggle to adequately depict specific early Dakota land claims. However, they agree that the Dakota emerged as a significant people in the region by the time of American expeditionary, geographical, and other records brought clarity to the historical record. The Dakota were occupying a large territory stretching from the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers to the lower Missouri. Within this range, they adaptively worked and faced competition and pressures from peoples including the Iowa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Omaha, Osage, as well as others. The prehistory of the Dakota, it continues to provide a difficult challenge for archaeologists. Lloyd Wilford and Eldon Johnson focused their work on several village sites near Mille Lacs Lake during the prehistory and contact eras, and their studies found common linkages between peoples occupying sites ranging from the Brainerd Complex in northern Minnesota to the Effigy Mound site in Iowa. Effigy Mounds, even today, recognizes significant ties to the Dakota, including the descendants of Inkpaduta's band. Of the 20 tribal groups affiliated with the site in northeastern Iowa, 10 are peoples of the Oceti-Sakowin. Archaeologists also concluded terminal woodlands peoples throughout what became Iowa and Minnesota shared a similar material culture and mobile hunter-gatherer lifeway built around gathering wild plant resources, including wild rice, and hunting deer, elk, and small mammals. Aside from this archaeological evidence, languages and oral histories illuminate the past. The Dakota speak a Siouan language. James Springer and Stanley Witkowski compared lexical terms from 16 different Siouan languages or dialects and identified 14 languages derivative from Proto-Siouan, a parent language centered in the central Mississippi Valley region around 500 BCE. Throughout the rest of prehistory, the language divided into subgroups several times. Building upon lingual research, oral traditions and written accounts commonly agree Minnesota, Northwest Iowa, and South Dakota served as the homeland of the Dakota prior to the 17th century. The earliest Europeans to enter the area of Dakota influence noted them repeatedly in what became northern Iowa. The French often encountered the Dakota between, and we can see that in Pierre Radisson's initial contact in the winter of 1659-60, all the way through Lesueur's account of the winter of 1700-1701, which he spent on the Blue Earth River. These accounts begin to clarify and expand European knowledge of the Dakota. The French also made maps, like the one you can see here, of areas occupied by the Dakota. Jean-Baptiste Franklin created the earliest known French map of the region in 1678, and Claude Delisle utilized Lesueur's geographical knowledge of the area to put out an improved map in 1702. Both of these maps clearly assert Dakota occupancy of the prairies of southwestern Minnesota and northern Iowa by at least 1680 to 1700. Accounts through the middle of the 19th century consistently identify the Dakota in the area around Spirit Lake, especially as they move back and forth with other peoples occupying the area. This further evidences how Inkpaduta's people occupied parts of what became Iowa from a time beyond the reaches of Western recorded history. As the French entered the upper Midwest, Bedote served as the spiritual center of the Dakota world at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. Gwen Westerman, who's an enrolled member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton Dakota Oyate, in her 2012 work wrote, to quote, "From there was a road to Spirit Lake in what is now Iowa. The people would walk or ride horses, and soon the different groups of Dakotas spread out on the south and west of Bedote and lived all through the prairies. Many villages were established around Spirit Lake," end quote. Spirit Lake also gained significance within Dakota tradition as the initial site of corn-based agriculture for the Dakota, as well as the origin site of the sacred corn dance. Contrary to characterizations of the Dakota as a strictly non-agricultural people, early observers consistently recorded the Dakota engaged in the process of growing corn. And we'll look at some of the specific examples here. So for instance, in the 17th century, Pierre Radisson's account detailed his exchanges of iron implements for corn. As Radisson traveled south several days after wintering on Lake St. Croix, he noted, to quote, "They sow corn, but their harvest is small," end quote. Military sources also show us this. U.S. Army topographical engineer Stephen Harriman Long visited Sakpe's village of Tintoatanwe in 1823 and recorded extensive corn cultivation on the south side of the Minnesota River. Samuel Pond, an early missionary to the Dakota, recorded the Dakota planting corn in hills during June and harvesting when it reached a, to quote, "green state," end quote. Although Pond minimized Dakota agricultural practices by suggesting they ate all of the harvested corn off the cob within a few days of pickings, also a few pages later in his account, he recorded, to quote, "Their corn was preserved by boiling it before it was hard, scraping it from the cob with mussel shells and drying it," end quote. So we can see that they were preserving corn that they were harvesting. Joseph Renshaw Brown, a prominent early settler, trader, and American negotiator at the 1851 Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, actively recorded that, to quote, he bought large quantities of it from the Dakota in 1831. The specific motivations of military, missionary, and civilian minimization of Dakota agricultural practice exist in doctrines of effective occupation necessary to 19th century treaty practice and serve as a potential motive for under-recording and oversimplifying the importance of limited agriculture within Dakota sustenance techniques. To dispossess the Dakota of lands, Americans readily asserted the Dakotas did not use the land in a meaningful way. By the time of Inkpaduta's birth, the Dakota built their lives around hunting, foraging, and agricultural practices to expertly manage the world around them and survive in a difficult climate. Over the course of Inkpaduta's lifetime, the environment around him began to change in significant and drastic ways as Americans entered the area. Declines in game populations began with the introduction of the commercial fur trade by the French and continued throughout the 19th century. As the Dakota sought to meet their dietary needs, they developed a variety of hunting and foraging practices specifically adapted to their homelands in Iowa and Minnesota, and this took place over generations that stretched down to Inkpaduta. The Dakota obtained vital proteins through hunting and fishing throughout the entirety of their range. Iowa's animal populations existed in large numbers, almost unfathomable today. Although quantification of animal populations prior to the 19th century proved difficult to determine, the work of devoted scholars like James J. Dinsmore help us see this. We can also see this through records of the earliest expeditions that went through the lands of northern Iowa to help develop some different insights. So, for instance, in February of 1820, Stephen Long noted his expedition took 12 bison from a herd on the Little Sioux River, an area also occupied by Inkpaduta. Also in 1820, Stephen Watts Kearney recorded bison in large numbers, noting the largest herd he encountered numbered an estimated 5,000 near modern-day Northwood, Iowa. The most numerous records of bison in Iowa come from near the headwaters of the Iowa, Cedar, and Des Moines rivers, right in the center of what I usually call the northern Iowa borderlands. Trader Joseph Hewitt of Clear Lake, 1851 account notes the presence of many bison near Clear Lake, and bison skulls have continued to be fished out of the waters as recently as 2019. By 1870, however, a settler observed the last two wild bison ever recorded in the state as standing on the shores of the Little Sioux River, not far from the site of Inkpaduta's attack on Spirit Lake. The decline of the bison, as well as other animal populations, drastically undercut the ability of the Dakota to maintain a diet high in protein during the first half of the 19th century. Aside from bison, deer and elk also played a critical role in sustenance for peoples occupying northern Iowa both before and after American colonization of the region. On his 1820 journey from Council Bluffs to modern-day Worth County, Stephen Watts Kearney noted the presence of elk in 5 separate journal entries. The largest grouping he saw consisted of roughly 200 elk cows on July 10th along the Little Sioux River, again, right in the heart of that Inkpaduta range. Joseph Street also estimated elk existed in greater numbers than bison throughout the region. Captain James Allen, from another military source during an 1844 expedition, noted a large herd of roughly 100 elk near the confluence of the east and west forks of the Des Moines River. Settlers also reported deer herds as large as 200 in northern Iowa as late as the 1870s. And deer were really important. They formed a staple of Dakota sustenance, especially for the Wapakute in Iowa during the 19th century. Dakota bands inhabited river valley hunting grounds starting each year in late September, early October, and hunted deer in backwater regions in particular. The Dakota scoured small streams and valleys, often moving away from the major rivers of an area to provide geographic dispersion necessary to not overtaxing local population of deer as well as other animals. This is really important because it's a sustainable hunting practice. Larger bands, like the one led by Sinto Minaduta, broke down into smaller groups, like Inkpaduta's, as winter approached. Dakota women would dry meat to provide a large surplus for winter months as the Dakota sought to navigate what can often be brutal winters in Iowa. Fish and birds also provide important sources of protein within the diets of the people living in northern Iowa prior to American colonization. The Dakota ate a variety of fish, including smallmouth bass, northern pike, perch, trout, and walleye. They most often fished during winter months by cutting holes in the ice and then using spears to stab at fish beneath the surface. Various birds also underpinned Dakota sustenance in this tough environment to the upper Midwest. The Dakota commonly clubbed birds more often than shooting, and they utilized a variety of different traps that we can see from both anthropological and Dakota-oriented sources. Like all Wapakute Dakota boys, Inkpaduta learned the diverse methods of hunting and fishing from older male tribal members. The skills passed down developed over centuries, and during Inkpaduta's lifetime, the decline of wildlife populations strained the ability of the Dakota to continue to utilize traditional methods to procure steady protein sources. Aside from the material changes to the environment undercutting the Dakota diet, diplomatic situations also had a large impact on the Wapakute, especially bands like Inkpaduta's, as formal relations with the United States changed during this time period as American power developed. Treaty negotiations began for the Dakota in 1805 with the expedition of Zebulon Pike up the Mississippi River and the agreement to the cession of lands for the eventual site of Fort Snelling. Successive treaties negotiated at Prairie du Chien in 1825 and 1830 brought together the vast diaspora of indigenous peoples from the upper Midwest for the United States government to focus on segmenting lands and then eventually reducing them throughout Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. In 1825, At the initial treaty in Prairie du Chien, the United States sought to parcel out lands in attempts to kind of hem in indigenous peoples, while also seeking to reduce violence by establishing clearly delineated boundaries between different tribal peoples. After the treaty concluded, conflicts almost immediately followed. The struggle between the Wapakute Dakota and the Meskwaki and Sauk in northern Iowa underscored the inadequacy of the treaty or Americans' abilities to enforce those provisions of the treaty in the immediate years following. For instance, if we're thinking about Inkpaduta's eventual band, the Wapakute leader Tasagi, as well as Inkpaduta's father Wamdasapa, attempted to follow the provisions outlined at Prairie du Chien in 1825. Both men visited Indian agent Lawrence Telefiero during 1829 to ask what the Americans planned to do about escalating violence between the Dakota and the Sauk and Meskwaki. After not receiving an adequate response, Wamdasapa resumed warfare. Telefiero focused on other pressing issues. He had a lot on his mind, including the starvation of 30 Dakota lodges under his supervision during the brutal winter of 1828-1829. The failure of the 1825 treaty undermined the Wapakute's belief in the validity of American treaties, and the fallout led to portions of the band refusing to participate in subsequent treaties, including the bands that eventually passed leadership to Sinto Minidoota and Inkpaduta. The critical flaws of the 1825 treaty are evidenced by the necessity of a second treaty in 1830. A young Inkpaduta undoubtedly bore witness to these events, and a strong likelihood exists they shaped his views as he went forward in life. The bands of Wapakute that passed leadership to Sinto Minidoota and Inkpaduta among them did not attend the proceedings for the 1830 Treaty of Prairie du Chien. The government acknowledged further treaties would prove necessary to complete their stated goal of, to quote, clearing the title, unquote, to the lands in order to allow for future purchases, but the Wapakute band, eventually led by Inkpaduta, would not take part in another meaningful negotiation of an American treaty during the era. After Tasagi's previous experience with the inability of the Americans to adequately execute treaty provisions, he indicated to Telefiero he did not believe the Sauk or Meskwaki would respect the 1830 treaty or the United States' commitment to upholding it. Clark threatened military invasion and a cessation of trade if the tribes did not respect the new, quote unquote, neutral ground that was placed between the Sauk, Meskwaki, and the Dakota, and includes places right on the border of it here in Forest City, my office at Waldorf University. The neutral ground provision of the 1830 treaty sought to move the Ho-Chunk, or what people commonly call the Winnebago, into northeastern Iowa to serve as a buffer between these tribal peoples that were often in conflict. The arrival of the Ho-Chunk only exacerbated tensions for indigenous people, the military and settlers alike, and eventually the Ho-Chunk were moved even further to the west. Eventual conflicts between the Dakota, the Ho-Chunk, and the settler community, like the one which developed at Clear Lake in the early 1850s on two different occasions, illustrate how resistant the Wapakute proved towards agreements they had not consented to, as well as their willingness to harass anyone in league with their traditional enemies. Additionally, the willingness of Tasagi, Wamdasapa, Sinto Minidoota, and Inkpaduta eventually led to American officials to characterize the bands as Dakota renegades, a portrayal undercutting the legitimacy of claims by these bands the state of Iowa formed. This is really important. Often Inkpaduta gets talked about as a renegade, but from my research, I think it becomes pretty clear that Inkpaduta is a renegade only to these American interests and those kind of sided with them. By the time the United States government did officially acquire the part of northern Iowa occupied by Inkpaduta, the Wapakute, in wide-ranging treaties at Traverse des Sioux and Mendota in 1851, the characterization of Inkpaduta as an opponent to American acculturation and the reservation system had already developed. Other portions of the Dakota people sold the vast majority of their lands for roughly 12 cents per acre, while consenting, at least in some way, to the creation of the reservation annuity system in Minnesota. The United States expected the tribe to locate to a small strip of land along the Minnesota River. Neither Sinto Minidoota nor Inkpaduta, both leading bands ranging throughout southern Minnesota and northern Iowa, signed the treaty. Both continued to lead their bands along the Blue Earth, Des Moines, and Little Sioux rivers, living life largely as their ancestors in previous generations. The creation of the treaty annuity system stimulated settlement in Minnesota and Iowa, exacerbated cultural tensions between the settler community and the Dakota, and created an illusion of safety for eager pioneers hoping to homestead in lands still occupied by the wide-ranging bands of the Dakota. The 1851 treaties stand as the culmination of bad faith dealings between the Dakota and the United States government as desperate traders offset losses due to declining animal populations by capturing over $500,000 of the treaty proceeds. The Dakota who honored the agreement and moved to the reservation faced radical life changes, which ultimately can be viewed as leading to the 1862 United States-Dakota War, while those who chose not to follow the treaty became further branded as outcasts and renegades, Inkpaduta among them. To enforce treaty provisions and provide a sense of security for Eastern American migrants and immigrants hoping to settle on agricultural homesteads, the government commissioned and decommissioned a series of forts throughout Dakota lands. 15 years after the Dakota made the initial treaty with Zebulon Pike, the military arrived at the heart of Dakota lands and began constructing Fort Snelling. Fort Snelling served as the northwesternmost fort in a chain extending southward to Oklahoma and existing to provide protection for American settlers while regulating their interactions with indigenous peoples. The American military struggled initially to adequately project power throughout the region, but the forts reassured migrants of their safety in choosing to settle in the areas protected by these forts. After the War of 1812, where the United States military largely failed against a British Indigenous alliance in the Mississippi River Valley, the military built Fort Crawford to house the treaty negotiations at Prairie du Chien. When the government completed the treaties of 1825 and 1830, the military frontier extended with the construction of Fort Atkinson in northeastern Iowa, which was put in place to help protect the Winnebago and relegate this neutral ground area. While the first Fort Des Moines marked the emergence of American power, the second Fort Des Moines marked the emergence of American power in the central portion of the state. The military positioned both forts strategically to ease tension between the Dakota and their traditional enemies, the Meskwaki and Sauk, while also providing protection for the Ho-Chunk, who underwent a forced removal from their Wisconsin homelands during the time period. The increased settlement developing under the protection of each fort created tensions, pushing the Dakota further to the north and west. The earliest forts projected little influence on Inkpaduta the Wapakute, still living in Iowa, but by the mid-1800s, the military arrived in their portion of the state, creating a much more consistent experience and interaction between the two. The military continued to move in tandem with the settlement of larger white populations in the eastern portion of Iowa during the first half of the 19th century. The construction of Fort Dodge near the confluence of the Des Moines River Forks in 1850 marked the arrival of the United States military in northwestern Iowa and consistently in the life of Inkpaduta. William Williams, a prominent figure in the establishment of the fort, referred to the river above the forks as, to quote, the river of the Sioux, unquote. The fort at Fort Dodge, constructed specifically at the edge of Dakota lands along the Des Moines River to project power near the large summer village of Sinto-Minaduta at Lizard Creek, signaled to pioneer populations the area had opened for settlement. Fort Dodge projected weak power at best, and the Wapakute continued to range similarly to previous decades. In 1853, the government decommissioned the fort and moved the garrison to Fort Ridgely in Minnesota, signaling to pioneers the Dakota once again had moved further north and west. In reality, Inkpaduta continued to lead the Wapakute in a life centered on summering in or around the Spirit Lake region and wintering near the confluence of the Little Sioux and Missouri rivers just south of modern-day Sioux City. Through the 1851 treaties and the abandoning of Fort Dodge, the government led settlers to believe the Dakota had cleared out of northern Iowa and the land stood ready for settlement. In contrast, Inkpaduta continued to confront settlers throughout the area in locations stretching from the Shell Rock River to the Missouri, from the decommissioning of Fort Dodge in 1853 until his attack on Spirit Lake in 1857. And we can really see him asserting Dakota sovereignty and autonomy throughout the region during this time period. Although the military would not become a consistent presence in Inkpaduta's life until Fort Dodge opens around 1850, his band faced other significant changes during the first half of the 19th century, among them disease, which smallpox served as one of the first manifestations of American influence on the Wapakute bands living in northwestern Iowa. Inkpaduta suffered smallpox personally during a major outbreak in 1837, and the epidemic cut the population of the Wapakute by as much as 75% by 1839, so incredible population loss. As a young man, he watched his father, Wamdisapa, tested treaty provisions and sought to lead their people through the initial adaptations necessary to the increased American presence in the region. When Inkpaduta reached adulthood, he took on the responsibility of helping to navigate the challenges faced during the most extreme time of change in northern Iowa. Following the wake of disease, American citizens became a more prominent presence in Dakota life, where previous interactions between the Wapakute and Americans took place only when a rare exploratory expedition passed through or at specified treaty gatherings. During Inkpaduta's adolescence and adulthood, individual citizens began to emerge into the geographic space where the Wapakute lived. By the fall of 1856, Inkpaduta had created a mixed legacy in the Northern Iowa borderlands through these interactions. He amicably worked with settlers who sought accommodation, like Charles Lamb at Smithland. He proved fair in trade with several traders throughout the Northern Iowa borderlands who continued to extend him credit well into the 1850s. In contrast, he challenged settlers consistently from the Cedar River, the Shell Rock, all the way to the Missouri. He captured 2 men on the Shell Rock River, confronted settlers at Clear Lake for housing the Ho-Chunk, and harassed surveying parties in Algona. Inkpaduta also largely ignored treaties he had not assented to, but also showed his knowledge of treaties when he sought to draw annuities on 2 separate occasions in Minnesota at specific agencies during the early 1850s. Like all people, Inkpaduta stands as a complex person actively seeking to navigate the challenges of the world around him. By the onset of the harsh winter of 1856-57, a variety of increasing pressures created a desperate tipping point moment for Inkpaduta and his band of Wapakute. The lands Inkpaduta called home rapidly began to change. As one contemporary account by Agnes C. Laut described it as an enchanted world, this started to yield to the eager pioneer's plow. The oak savannas of the area yielded to the settler's axe, and in time, a greater diversity of trees covered portions of a landscape formerly inhospitable to many species due to annual prairie fires. The process of ditching and draining wetlands began and resulted in over 1.5 million acres repurposed into agricultural lands over the time period that's elapsed between then and now. The complicated web of life in Northern Iowa faced a century-long shift from a prairie biome to the agricultural landscape we're all familiar with today. Inkpaduta witnessed the arrival of Americans and Europeans in accelerating numbers. And we can see some of this on the slide here, and some of the next slides I'll show you is quantification data from the 1836 through 1860 Iowa and United States censuses. The first half of the 19th century saw wide-scale change in terms of human population. At the onset of the century, a variety of indigenous people lived in, partially occupied, or regularly crossed through Iowa. By 1850, the population critically shifted toward American settlement. The white population of the state exploded during the middle part of the 19th century. From the first census recorded during the territorial era in 1836 to the United States Census of 1860, the recorded population of Iowa climbed from 10,531 to 674,913. Many of the inhabitants of Iowa still clustered in the eastern half of the state, even at that 1860 census, but settlement arrived in northern western Iowa to a point that made it a rapidly closing frontier. By the 1860 census, 21 of the 22 counties previously occupied by the Wapakute recorded American residents. For the 1860 census noted only Franklin, Hamilton, Hardin, and Webster counties is exceeding the 2 persons per square mile federal government population threshold for the moving frontier. But by 1865, Saragordo and Worth counties are going to join the previous group considered behind the frontier by the Census Bureau. In reality, the entire space had really ceased to be borderlands in a meaningful way by 1860. Inkpaduta undoubtedly watched these new people radically altered the landscape he entered. The first American settlers of the area quickly set about converting the tallgrass prairie that had 40 to 60 distinct species per acre into one focused almost solely on agriculture. Over the course of the 1850s alone, an area the government previously recorded as not having a single improved acre converted to agriculture in almost every area, and we can see some of that data on the kind of charts we have here. The government completed survey of 294,000 acres throughout the 22 county area previously occupied by the Wapakute by 1860, and considered about 93,000 of those acres improved. Over the course of the following decades, the land continued conversion to a point where agriculturalists converted 33,359,000 acres of Iowa's total land acreage of just over 36 million into agricultural lands by the times we're living in now. Although modern crop agriculture in Iowa focuses predominantly on corn and beans, a variety of other new crops propped up in the northern reaches of Iowa by 1860. By that time, we can see a harvesting area of about 616,000 bushels of corn, 80,000 bushels of wheat, and 102,000 bushels of oats. These numbers really signify kind of a shift from sustenance farming towards participation in a broader market. As settlers converted lands towards agricultural pursuits, Inkpaduta continued to lead his people as the diversity of wildlife throughout the region declined. During the 19th century, the great diversity of larger animals fell to a point where only 2 of the 9 initial large mammalian species continued to occupy the region. Although smaller animals and birds fared better during the environmental changeover, the diversity in those areas declined as well during the time period following initial American settlement in the northern Iowa borderlands. All told, 29 species of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish would be extirpated from Iowa, while 38 would become endangered and 19 more gained threatened status over the course of the 20th century, including deer, which were completely extirpated from Iowa and then reintroduced at another point, which I'm sure if you've had any motor vehicle accidents, you recognize that deer are back. Elk and deer populations specifically saw a significant reduction during the incredibly harsh winter of 1856-57. Deep snow limited forage and paired with desperate overhunting by people living in the area to decimate the population locations throughout the state. In place of the rapidly disappearing wildlife in Iowa, Inkpaduta and the Wapakute undoubtedly took notice of settlers introducing new animals. Cattle proliferated throughout the northern Iowa borderlands during this time period. By the 1860 census, 13,145 cattle lived in the area, a number roughly half of the newly arrived American population. Beasts of burden vital to breaking the tough prairie sod proliferated throughout the area as well, and settlers relied on horses and oxen to complement their own labors on newly founded farms. By 1860, the northern Iowa borderlands hosted 3,203 horses on farms, or roughly 1 for every 8 people. The Census Bureau did not record hogs individually, but the county, individually by counting the 1860 census, but they list the total number in the state at 540,088. Inkpaduta sought to continue to lead his people according to the time-tested seasonal sustenance strategies of the Dakota, despite these changes, and each year in the 1850s, provided an increasingly difficult situation. Inkpaduta's final days in Iowa are marked by desperate attempts at survival. After being disarmed by a local militia formed by settlers near their wintering, by the Wapakute wintering site near Smithland, the Wapakute headed into the forbidding winter unarmed. As the band headed north up the Little Sioux River, Inkpaduta watched as one of his grandchildren starved to death. Only as the Dakota returned to the site and area of their summer villages near Spirit Lake did the actions of the Wapakute turn to incredible violence as they struck out against the collected American settlements that had formed around the lakes. In the aftermath of these attacks, Inkpaduta, with captives in tow, fled west beyond the reaches of American justice, where he continued to live in pretty similar ways to as he had in Iowa with some of their more distant relatives in the Oceti-Sakowin. He was present at the Battle of Little Bighorn before eventually absconding to Canada with Sitting Bull, where he would live out the rest of his days. Inkpaduta's attack on Spirit Lake marked the end of a significant Dakota presence in Iowa in terms of population numbers. And in the aftermath, his people have been minimized in our state's history consistently. We can look at a variety of sources, and if you're really interested in that, please take a look at the Annals of Iowa article. I go through a lot of that, or take a look at my dissertation at the Iowa State Library, which is available for free there. Inkpaduta and his people's place in the history of Iowa needs to undergo an honest reconsideration. Only through recognizing and understanding how the Dakota lived in Iowa and how individuals, including Inkpaduta, sought to navigate a rapidly changing world, can we begin to better reconcile, honor, and understand the true and extensive legacy in our state's history. Abby Gardner-Sharp's voice dominates the discussion of Inkpaduta's attack on Spirit Lake after nearly 170 years. Iowans need a more nuanced understanding, not only of Inkpaduta's attack on Spirit Lake, but a more realistic interpretation of the Dakota in Iowa's past. It is clear the Dakota not only ranged into, but lived in Iowa as far back as Western sources date. With this knowledge, the story of Inkpaduta gains new levels of complexity, linking to a much deeper Dakota past than the one we've traditionally recognized. The incredible change encountered by the Dakota in Iowa as they navigated the first half of the 19th century precipitated the decision by Inkpaduta to attack the community he found on Spirit Lake. Only through understanding these environmental changes, pressures on Dakota sustenance, population expansion, dealings with the American government, and miscommunications between settler communities, the government, and the Dakota, does a more nuanced picture emerge, significantly altering the way in which Iowans should remember their shared past, as well as the role the Dakota played in the state from a time predating Western history. I really appreciate the attention you guys have given me here as we've worked over the last 40 some minutes through some of the more textual parts of this presentation. And I again want to encourage you to take a look at that article I have coming out in Annals of Iowa, as well as some of these other sources. I have a variety of things that can help us look at this conflict a little bit differently behind me here, and I'm happy to talk about any of those in the Q&A. I'm also happy to answer any of your other questions. And as we get through this, if you don't have time for questions, so you can look me up, send me your thoughts. I'm happy to visit with you about any of these things as we kind of work through this. This is something I obviously care about deeply, and want us to have these conversations. So if you're a teacher and you would like me to talk to one of your classes, I'm happy to do that. I've talked about this research in a variety of settings, from academic conferences to noon Rotary clubs. Or if you're just somebody that wants to link up and talk about it, I'm happy to visit with you more about this in my pursuit of trying to get some of this better contextualized and essentially right as we move through it. So I'm happy to open it up to, I know Matt's moderating questions. So if there are any I can help answer, I'm happy to do that now.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. We have a good list of questions to ask here, but we have a few minutes to answer some of the questions that have been posed here. However, before I ask the first question, I just want to remind our participants that you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature. However, we are on a schedule and we do have a list of questions. So please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the webinar. Now, here's our first question. And this is a topic that actually we discussed before the call today. How should educators or people in general address the Spirit Lake conflict, and what terminology should we use?
And this is, I think, a difficult question. Words matter. And as we look at this, I've moved away from referring it to any kind of massacre language. I think if we go through the developed historiography of that language and relating to some of the captivity narrative stuff and some of those other things, I think one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing is provide agency and contingency and recognition of the authentic nature of claims of the Dakota living in Iowa. And that's where I think like this environmental approach can really help us kind of gain a sense of how the Dakota lived here. And then I think that puts us in a new context where you can see the actions at Spirit Lake instead of kind of just being this quote unquote massacre. I think we can see it more as a conflict over land and natural resources, over sovereignty and autonomy, and also navigating different Dakota responses to the onset of kind of American acculturation in the region. So as I talk about it, I think being conscious and conscientious can both be important things to having more nuanced discussions and seeing the true historical complexity in these conversations.
Second question, did Inkpaduta have any relations with the Spirit Lake settlers before the attack?
That's an interesting question. So for instance, if we look at maybe the most dominant voice in this discourse, the Abby Gardner-Sharp captivity narrative that came out in 1885 initially and is still being reprinted today. Her family, before they pushed on to Spirit Lake across kind of the more what I would look at as the developed frontier line at that point in time, we can kind of see this as kind of she's going to interact with the Dakota in Clear Lake. Her family had a conscious knowledge of them, but settlement really doesn't come to the Spirit Lake region, or the Iowa Great Lakes, or Lake Okoboji, as we call them more frequently today in common parlance. Didn't really arrive there until the summer and even the late summer, early fall of the attack. As Inkpaduta passed south, we know that he was in Minnesota prior to descending the Little Sioux River in the winter of 1856-57. There were some limited interactions with some of those peoples, most of them at other communities kind of in the vicinity or at other points on the Little Sioux River, but there were some interactions, but pretty limited. Other Dakota leaders like Inkpaduta or a couple of other band leaders that were in the area also had interactions with settlers. So one of the things that I always just kind of think about this, or when I'm talking about it more simply, is to think about that settlers and indigenous peoples were interacting and adapting with one another pretty regularly during this time period in ways that I think bear out in sources from both perspectives.
Our next question is, was there also fierce competition for resources among the various Native American tribes as well?
Certainly. Competing for access to land and natural resources, or kind of designating land claims or areas that are used for sustenance, is something that long predates Western history here. That's one of the things that we can see, these already established kind of competition or conflict kind of areas between different groups. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is, as the United States is developing on the eastern coast in the post-revolutionary era, peoples are being pushed and moved in different ways, indigenous peoples all throughout the country, and creating even in more intense conflicts for access to land and natural resources than had been seen previously in time periods before that. But we can see this throughout Minnesota in particular when we're looking at the Dakota. There's well-documented instances from the Fort Snelling type of sources between the Ojibwe and Shinyabe and the Dakota. But also we can see this, it was a reality in virtually, in my opinion, all places throughout the continent, predating historical knowledge.
And this is basically the second part of that first question we just asked, but did the forestry settlements of the Native American tribes interfere with longstanding tribal turfs and therefore aggravate issues?
Yes. I mean, pretty simple answer. I think we can see this in Iowa in other tribal peoples as well. If you think about like what people commonly call the Black Hawk War, or kind of some of these interactions as people, as indigenous peoples are being moved and pushed, or just choosing to go to areas that are less inhabited by American settlers and other migrants coming into the kind of their traditional spheres of influence. We can see increases in conflict that I think are pretty clearly borne out in the sources we have available, as well as in tribal records and oral traditions and some of those types of things.
No, I'm always fascinated by people's research, and you've done lots of research. Do you have any favorite primary sources that you've discovered, and where did you do your research?
So I did research all over the place for this, as far away as the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but I spent a lot of time down with the great folks in Des Moines at the Archives of the State Historical Society. Were really critical to my research, as well as up in St. Paul in Minnesota. But then one of the things I was really committed to with this research was trying to get throughout this 22 county area that I kind of was able to identify records that Inkpaduta had stopped in, or had spent time in, or met within. As my research kind of unfolded, I was able to see, kind of start to establish this area as far away as the Shell Rock River, kind of here in north central Iowa where I'm at, all the way to the Missouri River. And I tried to, like, I don't know, go out and turn over as many rocks as I could and see what I could find as I worked through these different things. And one of my the favorite kind of, I've been going through all these, and I've been traveling over in parts of northwestern Iowa and working on some of this. And I live in Mason City in Saragordo County. And I had neglected to go to my own local archive at the Mason City Public Library. And I went there one day, to check out a book, and I decided to stop into the archives because I saw they were open, and found an incredible source that they have preserved the journal and store ledger of a trader named Joseph Hewitt, who was at the Mason City Clear Lake area and had all sorts of information that really I don't know. That was probably my favorite source I ran into in terms of kind of American colonial sources. There's a ton of great research out there about the Dakota people that continues to develop all the time. I mentioned Gwen Westerman and Bruce White's book earlier that came out. Let me think about it. It would have come out in 2012. There was a great book by Paul Beck called Inkpaduta, Dakota Leader, that I think he did a great job of looking at some of this agency, and I hope I've been able in small ways to build on Paul's work. And that book came out in 2008. Mary Hawker Bakeman, in 2001 came out with a collection of primary sources that is great, and I think can really provide a lot of meaningful insights into things. She collected a lot of different sources. And then we even have other things coming out. Like, for instance, right behind me, Gary Kelly's got a book coming out later this week that's a graphic novel about the conflict at Spirit Lake that I thought was pretty interesting. And I encourage you, if you're just interested in this, you like graphic novels, to check that out. And then there's been a ton of other work by lots of people kind of tangentially related to this in preserving military records and creating better understanding. People like Lance Foster, who was in this series earlier this year, who did a great kind of work on putting together stuff about Indigenous peoples of Iowa. William Whitaker's collection of books on the frontier forts of Iowa is a great source to take a look at and better understand kind of that movement of the frontier line. Works by people like Gary C. Anderson, who worked on Dakota kinship, have been really important. There's a ton of stuff out there. The great thing about history is you can always find more complexity to get into. I mean, that's one of the reasons I really want to encourage you, if these are conversations you want to continue, if there are things that you see in my work that can be improved or that I can continue to develop with knowledge you have, send them my way. I think like we need to keep attention on these topics and continue developing these conversations, both from a historiographical context, but then also just in our state as a whole, to kind of move towards a more nuanced and complex conversation that better honors and represents our true past.
Now, this is our last question, and we spent the program looking at the past, but let's look at the future. Do you have any upcoming projects?
Yeah, I'm really excited. So I've kind of come out of this giant project, and I have this Annals article coming out. But then this summer, I'm doing something kind of fun. I think I'm going to spend a bunch of time walking with my 2 feet up the Des Moines River from the site of First Fort Des Moines near Montrose, all the way to Minnewacan State Park in Spirit Lake. And while I do that, I'm going to take the journal of the 1835 Iowa Dragoons and hopefully use their records of the geography and the natural environment to contrast with what I see as I go up the river. And I'm going to be filming a lot of documentary pieces, putting out a lot of media in different ways on social platforms and some of that stuff, and hopefully culminating in a book project, or I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm going to create something really weird, and I hope you'll follow along and check it out, because I think it should be pretty, hopefully interesting. And so I hope you'll check in with that.
That's amazing. I look forward to seeing that. And with that answer, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. I think we can all agree it's been a very informative lunch. It's been great. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody, it's a beautiful day. So I appreciate you spending your lunch indoors visiting with me about the Dakota and Iowa. And also thank you to everyone joining us today. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History Month webinars on Tuesdays and Thursdays in March. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for our future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programming, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Now, thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Look forward to virtually seeing you here again Tuesday, March 9th for our third Iowa History Month webinar. Thanks, everyone.